I do want to continue some international headlines right now. You're taking a look at some video from the Russian-Ukraine war. And I did want to share the very latest as escalations continue between Ukraine and Russia as the war itself continues. This past week has seen the most significant escalation in hostilities that Ukraine has witnessed since Russia's full-scale invasion, and also marks a new chapter in the nearly 3-year war. President Biden reversing a long-standing policy by granting Kyiv permission to deploy American longer-range missiles inside Russian territory. Meanwhile, Russia launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, otherwise known as an ICBM, into Ukraine. 2 people were wounded in that attack, and an industrial facility and a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities were damaged, according to local officials. Now, that attack comes as tensions continue to grow following the U.S. easing restrictions, of course, on Ukraine's use of those longer-range missiles inside Russia. Also, the Kremlin has lowered its threshold for launching nuclear weapons, and President Vladimir Putin has signed a new doctrine that allows for a potential nuclear response, even to a conventional attack on Russia by any nation that is supported by a nuclear power. To speak more on this, I do want to bring in Mark Temnycky, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Mark, we do appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
So a lot of concerning developments over the last week as we have seen tensions continue to escalate when it comes to the significance of these developments and the potential impact to the trajectory of the war. You know, what can you share with us?
This, unfortunately, is nothing new from the Russian Federation, and there are a few examples throughout this almost 3-year war. When the United States, European Union, NATO, and other countries around the world first provided long-range missiles for the Ukrainians in April of 2013 and HIMARS and other forms of assistance, the Russians responded by bombing a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Following that incident in June of 2023, when the Ukrainians received additional types of long-range missile capabilities to strike Russian military targets, the Russians responded by destroying the Novokhovka Dam in Ukraine, and that flooded a lot of wheat and grain fields within Ukraine. More recently, in August of this year, when F-16s, something that the Ukrainians have been asking for nearly since the war began, when they arrived finally in Ukraine, the Russians retaliated by bombing energy sector and energy infrastructure within Ukraine. And now more recently, last week, finally, when the Ukrainians received capabilities and permission to strike Russian targets within Russian Federation, the Russians responded by dropping this deadly weapon on Ukraine. The unfortunate thing as well is the Russians are targeting non-military targets. When they are conducting these attacks, they're bombing Ukrainian hospitals, schools, residential areas, cultural centers, and the Russians are responding by trying to invoke fear among the Ukrainian population by striking these targets, whereas when the Ukrainians receive these weapons, they are striking Russian military depots, Russian weapons factories, and other areas that allow the Russians to continue this horrible war on their country.
And I want to ask you this because there is another development with President Putin signing a new doctrine that allows for a potential nuclear response to even a conventional attack by any nation that is supported by a nuclear power. No doubt that's in response to President Biden giving permission to Ukraine to use these longer range missiles. But what does that mean? Obviously, that is a very strong statement. Is there any realistic possibility, though, that this could become an even larger war because of this?
During a recent press conference, the Biden administration said that they had no evidence suggesting that the Russians will launch a nuclear attack on Ukraine. Throughout the war as well, for nearly 3 years, the Russians have been threatening nuclear warfare on numerous occasions, and yet nothing has occurred from these situations. Now, of course, it's very important to be prepared if something horrible such as that were to occur. But currently, there's no evidence to suggest that Russia would even conduct some sort of nuclear war on Ukraine, and it's a way to try to invoke fear within Ukraine as well as in the Western world to try and prevent the Ukrainians from receiving the weapons they need to defend themselves from the Russian attack. This is nothing more than additional saber rattling and trying to scare individuals by making these types of statements with nothing to back
So
it up.
perhaps
And the
this is
West,
right, and perhaps this is more political posturing. I do want to ask you this
yes.
because Russia has also now ratified its pact with North Korea, and we've seen North Korean troops now entering into the war. When it comes to that, what do you make of that development?
It suggests that the Russians are getting desperate, and there's a few reasons why. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, for nearly 3 years, the Russians have had over 730,000 casualties, so they're relying on other military manpower to assist them in their war. The North Koreans have sent 10,000 soldiers. The Russians have also recruited mercenaries from India and Yemen, as well as other countries where either Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary organization, and others to try and help them fight in this war. Currently, the introduction of North Korean soldiers is very poor for the Russians because, first of all, they have a language barrier. The North Koreans can't communicate with the Russians because they can't speak to one another. They also, as different militaries, they organize and have different types of tactics of movements. And there were even some reports when the North Koreans first arrived that some of the North Koreans actually accidentally fired and killed a few Russian soldiers while they were trying to engage with Ukrainian soldiers. So this is an embarrassment for the Russians. The war is not going to plan. They initially thought that they would be able to take over Ukraine in 15 days, and instead, February of 2025 will mark 3 years of their full-scale invasion.
So we've seen a lot of developments in the last week. When it comes to momentum, though, does one side have it, or really is it just a give and take right now?
The Russians have the financial advantage as well as the numbers advantage, where the Russians can get additional conscripts. Russia just is a larger country by population and by GDP compared to Ukraine. From those perspectives, it has those advantages. And Russia is really the only country that can decide when and if it will continue the war or it will be forced to end, something similar to like when the Soviet Afghanistan war occurred or the first Russian invasion of Chechnya. The Ukrainians continue to ask the international community. They don't want foreign troops fighting in their war. They don't need foreign boots on the ground. They just ask for the additional weapons that they need to continue this fighting. And while the Ukrainians have done a very good job maintaining their country and forcing the Russians out from northern and central Ukraine, the Russians are still very dug in Crimea, as well as parts of southern and eastern Ukraine, territories that they have controlled since 2014. So with the upcoming winter, it's unlikely that there will be many changes to the battlefield lines and how things will develop. But of course, one never knows how the next day will go and what types of events will happen. With the Ukrainians having permission to now strike military targets within Russia by allowing Ukraine to strike ammo depots, weapons factories, gas facilities that are required for Russian equipment, this will delay Russia's advancements because they need those types of weapons and equipment to continue their war.
And you were sharing with us, of course, this is coming up on the 3-year mark of this war. As we continue to take a look at the weeks ahead, is there any particular potential situation or development that you are keeping a close eye on?
Seeing how the North Korean soldiers are able to better assimilate with Russian forces, and will this actually materialize, or will this be a further embarrassment for the Russian Federation as the Russians also invite more mercenaries to fight in the war, and seeing how the Ukrainians respond. And I think it's important that 3 years on, there's no other country other than Ukraine that wants this horrible war to end. But numerous public opinions and polling show that 72% of the Ukrainian population within Ukraine believes the only way the war can end is by forcing the Russians entirely out, and they do not want a ceasefire or a peace agreement at this time because they know that this will allow the Russians to regroup and re-strategize, and Russia would launch a future attack in the years to come.
Now, you were mentioning that the development, the situation with the North Korean troops has proved to be an embarrassment of sorts for Russia. Is there any particular situation you think that Russia would then sever those ties and allow those North Korean troops to go back home? Or do you think that they're going to continue with this, even though it does not seem as much of a win, so to speak, for Vladimir Putin?
I think the Russians will continue to invite as many forces as possible to assist them in continuing this war. And while they have frustration and difficulties with North Korean soldiers, President Putin and his inner circle do not want to admit publicly that they are making mistakes and that they are leading to failures in the war. And they will continue to push forward with this policy.
Mark, before we let you go, is there anything else that you wanted to share with our Live Now from Fox viewers?
The Ukrainian community within Ukraine, as well as the diaspora around the world, are very grateful for the assistance the international community has provided, where it's been humanitarian, financial, and medical assistance, and to continue providing these forms of aid as the Ukrainians need it as they fight to win this war.
All right, Mark, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you for having me.